Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Khaled Ben David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments and security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. After 12 days of war, Israel and Iran agreed to a ceasefire mediated by U.S. President Donald Trump. 29 Israeli civilians were killed and over 3,000 wounded by Iranian missile attacks. Prime Minister Netanyahu says Operation Rising Lion achieved its goals of degrading Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. U.S. officials insist its airstrikes severely damaged the Fordow facility, contradicting some intelligence reports. The Iranian regime arrests over 700 people for suspected ties with Israel and executes 3 on claims they were Mossad agents. The crackdown comes after Israel eliminates most of Iran's military leadership and nuclear scientists during the war. 7 IDF soldiers are killed when their armored personnel carrier is set ablaze by an explosive device in Khan Yunis. It is the worst single casualty incident since Israel renewed its offensive Operation Gideon's Chariot to attain full security control over Gaza and pressure Hamas to release the 50 remaining hostages. And now our big item. Israel's most famous war lasted 6 days. Its war with Iran just double that. In many ways, this conflict was unprecedented. It was a battle fought exclusively in the air between 2 nations over 1,700 kilometers apart. It featured the use of weapons never before tried in combat. And for the first time, the U.S. took an active offensive role in one of Israel's wars. Whether this conflict will have the lasting impact of the 6-day war remains to be seen, and it depends largely whether Israel achieved its stated goals of crippling Iran's nuclear program and military capability, and the ancillary aim, perhaps, of undermining the regime of the mullahs. Here's what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to say, summing up the war.
אזרחי ישראל היקרים, ב-12 הימים של מבצע עם כלבי השגנו ניצחון היסטורי, והניצחון הזה יעמוד לדורות. הסרנו מעלינו 2 איומים קיומיים מיידיים, איום ההשמדה בפצצות גרעין ואיום ההשמדה ב-20,000 טילים בליסטיים. אם לא היינו פועלים עכשיו, מדינת ישראל הייתה עומדת בקרוב בפני סכנת השמדה. אבל זה לא קרה. כי ברגע המכריע קמנו כלוי, נעמדנו כארי, והשאגה שלנו הרעידה את טהרן והדהדה בכל העולם.
And joining us in the studio now is Colonel Richard Kemp. He is the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Richard, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Richard, let's start with the obvious question many are asking. Did Israel win this war decisively?
I think there's no question Israel won the war decisively, if not totally destroying the Iranian regime. It certainly inflicted immense damage on the regime. I think maybe the Prime Minister here in Israel, the Chiefs of Staff, might have wanted to continue it a few more days, but they were not just working to their own schedule, they were also working to President Trump's schedule. And I think the benefits of keeping Trump on side and complying with his requests, I think, outweighed the maybe small amount of damage they could have done over perhaps a few more days.
Well, let's talk about the amount of damage, because, of course, one of the big questions now, and almost something of a debate, is how much the nuclear facilities of Iran were damaged, especially the Fordow plant. There have been some conflicting reports. Initial reports said that it was not significant damage. The CIA has now come out with a report saying there was significant damage. As an analyst, how do you see it?
Well, I don't see how there could have been anything but very, very significant damage, with the weight of ordnance dropped by both Israel and particularly by the United States with its B-2 bombers and submarine-launched cruise missiles. Now, we don't know, none of us know, the real extent of the damage, but it's got to have set back the Iranian nuclear program, I would have said, by many, many years. I know there's been talk of 2 years. I think it's much more than that. So I think a huge amount of damage must have been done. And it's not just that physical damage to the infrastructure, it's also the damage done to the regime's psyche. They've got to now seriously think whether they want to re-embark on a nuclear program and start on it pretty much from scratch, or wait maybe for a period of time until people like President Trump's out of the White House and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's no longer Prime Minister here, when it might be safe for them to do so.
Right. Now, as you say, mentioned the U.S. taking an active offensive role for the first time in any of Israel's wars, unprecedented, surely. In the run-up to this, of course, there were a lot of questions raised about the strength of the U.S.-Israel alliance. What is the bigger meaning, significance that the U.S. took this degree of involvement, that President Trump made that historic and courageous decision to launch the strike?
I think it says a huge amount for the relationship between the U.S. administration and the political leadership in Israel. And clearly a strike like this is not planned overnight. This must have been planned months ahead before even Israel launched its preemptive operation against Iran. And it's the fruit, I think, of huge amount of effort by Israel particularly to make sure that the US understands the reality of the situation it faces and maintains the best possible relations with Israel. And President Trump himself has said, I think today or yesterday, that there's never been a closer relationship between Israel and the United States than exists today.
Right. And maybe also, what is the bigger meaning for the United States itself? Because we know, following the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, that you know well, there was talk of the fact of the U.S. withdrawing from active conflicts abroad, this new isolationist trend. You know, in my generation, they talked about the Vietnam syndrome. Some people have talked about an Iraq or an Afghanistan syndrome. And here President Trump decided against, we should say, even among some of his most ardent supporters, to launch the strike. What is the bigger meaning, do you feel, for the United States here?
I think it's a turning point. And of course, one of the US's lowest points in its military history was the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. And not only was that terrible for Afghanistan and for US deterrence in Afghanistan, it was also a terribly bad message to be sending to the whole of the world. And I think, you know, for example, President Putin decided to invade Ukraine very soon afterwards, having seen America's weakness in Afghanistan. This new situation and Trump's willingness to show himself as a military strongman, I think, will not only reinforce deterrence in the Middle East, but it also reinforce deterrence, US deterrence around the world. And you just have to look at the challenges America faces from Putin and from China. And I think this is a major change in policy, which will have, I think, lasting impact, certainly for the duration of the time that Trump is the president.
Well, let's talk about one of the impacts, and you alluded to it earlier when you said Iran may choose to try to make a deal now, may wait another time, but we know supposedly talks are even set to resume next week between the U.S. and Iran. What are the chances of a deal, some kind of new nuclear deal coming to, and what would that potentially look like in the wake of this war?
I think we can see a potential deal, but in my way of thinking, any deal with Iran is not worth the paper it's printed on. So, fine, we can have some kind of agreement on not enriching any more uranium or whatever, not weaponizing, whatever it might be, maybe even removal of any uranium that remains in Iran, but we can't rely upon Iran to honour that deal. Who's going to enforce it? Which troops are going to go there and oversee and supervise that? You know, the dismantling of the remainder of the program. I don't think it could happen, but I don't think it's of any great significance.
Right. I want to then talk about the perhaps impact this conflict would have had on another, let's say, deal that's been talked about, which is a kind of Middle East alliance, a Mid-East NATO that would involve Israel, or include Israel along with, of course, the Abraham Accord nations it's already has relations with, but potentially even bring in Saudi Arabia, maybe even now Syria, which we're talking about now. Did the conflict in Iran and its revolution impact on the odds of that happening?
I think it did. And we know that Saudi Arabia has been extremely keen on US security guarantees in the Middle East, including a kind of NATO in the Middle East. Now, whether it's going to be acceptable in PR terms for Israel to be part of that, actually openly a part of that, I don't know the answer to that question. We've seen a number of Arab states, maybe unofficially, anonymous sources saying they're very concerned about how effective Israel has been, and basically Israel now is a kind of a dominant, it always has been pretty much, a dominant military power in the Middle East, and how that concerns them. I don't think we can take any of that seriously. I think pretty much every Arab country is right behind Israel on this, has been behind Israel in Gaza as well to a very large extent, wants Israel to show its strength and to be strong, because of course most Arab countries know that the threat from Iran has been just as potent against them as it has against Israel. The Ayatollahs hate Sunni Arab countries just as much or even more than they hate Israel.
By the way, we should mention also Iran firing at that U.S. base in Qatar, a country that has been maybe its closest sort of ally in the region. And of course, the impact that might have, for example, on a country like Qatar suddenly realizing that when push comes to shove, it's going to find itself in the Iranian line of fire.
Yeah, and not just Qatar. Of course, that attack on the US base in Qatar was very much performative. It was telegraphed well ahead. It did nothing really, it had no effect, but nevertheless was an act of aggression against another Arab country. But it's not just Qatar, it's also Saudi Arabia, the UAE and other countries in the region. They've both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have come under attack, and Iraq as well, have come under attack by Iran in the past. They know how much Iran threatens them. So I think, you know, if anything, that this whole episode, this whole series of events really strengthens, I think it strengthens the likelihood of an Abraham Accords being extended around the Middle East to other countries, because they've seen now that Israel is not only, and the US as well, is not only willing to, not only has the capabilities, willing to use it.
Now, you talked about how this war is going to be assessed. In part depends on, for example, to what degree it weakened the regime of the mullahs. As we're speaking here in studio, the Ayatollah Khamenei has not been seen out in public or seen at all since the closing days of the war. Reports are he's hiding out in his bunker. He might have even had some kind of breakdown, which raises the question of regime change. That wasn't achieved during the course of the war. Is that still a realistic goal, for example, for Israel, for the U.S.? What are the chances that this war will hasten that result?
Yeah, I think it's very questionable how much influence Khamenei had during the duration of this war. I suspect he was not involved in the decision-making. I think he's in a state of trauma with all his key advisors taken out of the game, and possibly considering he stares defeat of the regime in the face, which, of course, is the #1 priority, maintenance of the regime. It was unlikely, I think, that an overthrow of the regime would occur during the war itself, but I certainly think there is a possibility, and I don't know how strong, a possibility that the regime could be overthrown in the coming days, weeks, months, possibly, as oppositionists in Iran have now seen the weakness of the regime that's been oppressing them for so long. That could come from individual groups, perhaps from large uprising among the people, or it could possibly come from the army, for example, which is not a great admirer of the regime and could well stage a military coup. We'll have to see, I think.
Right. Now, as a military analyst and I guess somewhat of a historian, I want to ask you about the way this war was fought, because in some ways it was unprecedented even in the annals of military history. This was a war fought entirely in the sky. Basically two missile systems and air defense systems fighting against each other. Countries, as I said before, that are at least 1,700 miles apart, kilometers apart. I want to ask you about that, because this was something I think unheard of.
I think it was, and we've seen many times, we've seen kind of airstrikes, limited airstrikes taking place against jihadists around the region by the United States, by the UK, by other countries. This is the first time, I think, we've seen an all-out war between two states, which has been conducted entirely from the air. And I think, the effectiveness of that obviously speaks to Israel's military capabilities, but it also speaks very, very much to Israel's intelligence capabilities, because you could not have conducted such a pinpoint, effective campaign, which has killed so many top-level members of the regime, as well as nuclear scientists, etc. I think that plays into this picture a lot, and it also speaks to Israel's many years of practices, rehearsals, coordination with the US as well. As I mentioned before, I think the US strike couldn't have been done without significant coordination well in advance with Israel.
Right. All right. Well, certainly, yes. I think when they write the history of this war, they'll be looking at the just incredible achievements of the IDF, especially the Israeli Air Force and the intelligence apparatus. Richard, I want you to stay with us because we should note that the relief that was felt by Israelis at the end of the Iran war was tempered by the tragic news out of Gaza this week. The loss of 7 IDF soldiers who were killed by an explosive device in Khan Yunis. Now, that brought Israel's post-October 7th death total in Gaza combat to at least 440, and there has been a notable increase in recent weeks. The question now is if the results of Israel's war with Iran may bring it closer to some kind of resolution in Gaza that would free the remaining 50 hostages there and finish off Hamas's remaining military capability. Well, let me just start and ask you, Richard, your view. Did the outcome of the war with Iran, will it impact in any way on the situation, the military situation in Gaza?
I think it will, because if nothing else, clearly a defeat of Hamas's main sponsors must impact on Hamas's morale, on their belief in their ability to keep fighting and keep dying and nevertheless prevail. That's got to have been diminished. So I think it's not necessarily going to see the end of the war right now, but I think it could certainly impact on their fighting effectiveness and their willingness to keep fighting. It may also lead them to maybe go along with potential negotiations to release more of the hostages. I hope that's the case, but ultimately, whether that happens or doesn't happen, Israel has to keep going until Hamas is completely defeated.
Well, let me ask you about that, because there are voices in Israel, certainly the hostage families and their supporters, but even among some in the security establishment, who believe that even if a resolution does not, there's an agreement of some kind that does not achieve that goal of totally eliminating Hamas's military capability, the goal now should be freeing the hostages, and maybe Israel will have to go back or deal with Hamas at a later date.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible that there could be a deal, and that should be a very high priority. But I don't think it should be any kind of a deal which prevents Israel from returning after whatever number of days is involved to striking Hamas and keeping on going until Hamas is defeated. I think both of those two things are extremely important, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive either. I don't believe, even let's say Israel agreed in a deal, okay, we will withdraw from Gaza and we won't go back. I don't believe that all the hostages would be released, even if that was the case. I think these are Hamas's main bargaining chips, and they will want to hang on to at least some of them in perpetuity.
Well, what kind of security arrangements? Again, this is another one of the debate, like whether there needs to be some kind of a no-go zone established around Gaza to create more space between Gaza and the Israeli communities next to it. The question of whether Israel has to maintain full control over the border area with Egypt. How do you see what kind of security arrangements over the long term Israel will need to have in Gaza to make sure that an October 7th will not happen again?
Well, whatever happens to the internal organization, running, administration of Gaza, reconstruction, if that happens, whatever happens there, in my opinion, Israel must maintain a very strong security presence and must control Gaza. Obviously, if Hamas is defeated, something else is going to take its place. It's not the end of the story. And Israel can't afford to allow that to spiral down into the kind of 7th of October situation again. So I think certainly full control over the Philadelphia corridor with the border between Gaza and Egypt, and probably the basing of Israeli Defense Force soldiers inside Gaza. But that's a kind of almost a tactical detail for the IDF to work out, whether they can control it from the outside or they need to have a permanent presence inside, and maybe the ability to come and go as they see fit. Right.
Now, one of the challenges Israel is facing right now in Gaza is the situation of distributing humanitarian aid. Of course, Israel did set up this new system working with U.S. contractors to bypass for example, some of these UN agencies that have been compromised by Hamas and were in fact allowing Hamas to dictate how the aid was being distributed among the population and to hoard it. But there are reports now of difficulties with this new system, that Hamas is still getting its hands on some of the aid, and question of whether Israel now has to sort of rethink this, even set up a new system. I know you've been down to Gaza, I believe, and have seen how this is working. Give us your assessment, what you've seen and what you think may need to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I visited the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, one of their aid bases where they distribute aid directly to the people. And during the time I was there, about 2 hours, 20 truckloads of aid were distributed to around 20,000 people. It's pretty chaotic, but not overly so, nothing you wouldn't expect. And I think most people got the aid they needed. And the system, to me, seems to be working. That's not to say that some of the people who get some of the aid wouldn't pass it on to Hamas or whatever afterwards. So it's not a perfect system. But I think it's probably the best system that could be produced in the time. And the evidence of that, I think, is the absolute hostility of Hamas to this system.
Right, they've been trying to undermine this, sabotage this system and discredit it from day one.
They've killed a lot of, at least 8 local employed members of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I spoke to many Gazans inside the base that I was at, probably at least 50 of them. They told me how they'd been threatened by Hamas. They told me they feared Hamas because they came to collect the aid. And interestingly, one of the words that I heard most while I was there was "kill Hamas," get rid of Hamas. So clearly, the aid system, not perfect, is a thorn in the flesh for Hamas, and maybe a turning point in this conflict, wresting at least some of the control of the food from Hamas.
Well, that certainly will be, I think, a key element of trying to create some kind of post-Hamas situation, authority there in the Gaza Strip. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being in Israel and being with Israelis during this whole period of this war, and you've been very supportive of it. And thank you for coming with us today to ILTV Security Brief.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And now, a final word. In May 1948, just minutes after Israel declared its independence, American President Harry Truman awarded it official recognition by the U.S., making it the first country to do so and lending the new Jewish state international legitimacy. In doing so, Truman compared himself to Cyrus the Great, the ancient Persian ruler who in the 6th century BC allowed the exiled Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland in the land of Israel. Truman's act also set the foundation for an alliance between the U.S. and Israel, a partnership that has now reached new heights, both figuratively and literally, with President Trump's decision to order the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities. His act not only helped secure Israel's physical survival, but reaffirmed the long and deep ties between Washington and Jerusalem, a relationship that has been increasingly questioned and even maligned in the American political landscape by both Trump's political opponents and even among some of his most ardent supporters. Trump's decision was thus courageous on many levels, and Israel, this region, and the world's democracies should be grateful for that. But the U.S. strike on Iran has the potential to do far more than just temporarily neuter the Iranian nuclear threat. President Trump has made clear his goal is not more war, it is securing the peace. And his first step in doing so was mediating the ceasefire between Israel and Iran. This would be a Mideast peace through strength, built not on illusionary goals, but based on the mutual security and self-interest of the countries in this region. If regime change in Iran is not in the cards in the immediate future, President Trump still has the opportunity to build a regional security alliance between Israel and its Arab neighbors that would constitute a permanent bulwark against the regime of the mullahs in Iran and isolate it until the Iranian people themselves successfully rise up against the dictatorship which has choked that proud and ancient nation for over 4 decades. President Trump has talked about helping to make Iran great again. And in that sense, he too, like Harry Truman, can lay claim to the legacy of Cyrus the Great. Degrading Iran's nuclear facilities was a first step in that direction by undermining the rule of the mullahs. Now Trump can carry that further with a Mideast diplomacy that is equally brave and bold. It may not win him the Nobel Peace Prize he should have received for forging the Abraham Accords, but he will be awarding this nation and this region a prize of genuine peace that would be remembered down through the ages. Thank you for joining ILTV Security Brief.